This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's ChangeMaker is Emily Cadik, the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition. Her previous experience includes her time as Senior Director of Public Policy at Enterprise Community Partners. Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Katie. It's great to be here.
You became Executive Director at the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition several years ago, but you've really been advocating for the low-income housing tax credit for quite a while. How did you get started here?
So I started my career at HUD in the Public Housing Division and was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to visit public housing agencies all over the country. So I got to see what housing looks like and what challenges are faced in cities like Boulder and Baltimore and Seattle and New Haven. And that really helped me learn about the importance of flexible tools to meet local challenges. But also the common theme we saw in all of these cities, of course, was the need for more affordable housing. So after learning more about how these programs really operate, I realized what I wanted to do was be in a position to make the case to policymakers about what resources are needed or what programmatic changes are needed to really solve some of these issues. So I find that there's nothing more rewarding than being able to influence the legislative or regulatory process in ways that maybe sound arcane, but actually have a concrete impact on millions of people or entire cities or communities. And in the case of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, it's really an honor to work with the people who are actually building and financing affordable housing. Our members have built or financed well over half of all affordable housing in the U.S. So when we make recommendations about what works and what doesn't, whether it's to members of Congress or the IRS or HUD, we're taken really seriously, and we know that our recommendations will contribute to more sound policymaking.
I want to go through some of those recommendations, but before we do that, most of our listeners are familiar with the low-income housing tax credit, but for the folks that don't, can you just give us a primer on what exactly the low-income housing tax credit does?
The basic premise of the low-income housing tax credit is to make it economically feasible to build homes for people earning low incomes in charge rents that they can actually afford, which is not currently economically viable. You would have to reduce the cost of the building by so much that it would no longer be viable or safe. So the idea was to do this through a public-private partnership that involves the Treasury Department, state housing agencies, private developers, both nonprofit and for-profit, investors and syndicators, who all rely on this housing being built to certain standards and rented to people who are low income and eligible in order for the credits to even begin flowing. Because there's a cap on the program, it's highly competitive, it's very self-regulating. It actually has the lowest foreclosure rate of any real estate asset class, which shows you just how much all of these kind of internal checks and balances work in the program. And I also want to emphasize that, the purpose of the housing credit, as opposed to a lot of other housing programs, is to actually build housing, and really it's about bricks and sticks. So we have a number of subsidies in housing policy in the US. But for example, in tight real estate markets, which are becoming increasingly common, there's just not enough homes to even use the subsidies, and we really have to expand the supply. And when you also think about certain populations like formerly homeless veterans or seniors, sometimes you really need to provide housing that has certain amenities or certain features to actually make the residents successfully housed rather than kind of sending them to find something on their own. So it's part of the broader housing ecosystem, but it really serves a critical role in actually expanding the supply of affordable housing. And it's really the only tool that we have to do that at a meaningful scale. And just to put some numbers on it, this model has financed over 3.5 million affordable homes, which have over the last 30 plus years served 8 million households. And in addition to the obvious benefits for the residents, support a lot of economic activity in the communities where it's built. So nearly 6 million jobs supported over that time and generating hundreds of billions of dollars in local economic activity.
This is a highly competitive tool, but it has yielded so much, providing that extra funding or the incentive or however you want to describe it. And, this tool's been around for nearly 30 years. How have you seen it be embraced by communities? Or, obviously the incentives are there for the builders and the investors, but, that community connection. Have you seen a maturity of the community to understand this and embrace this? Or, are you still trying to start from scratch when you go into communities, or, what's happened over these last 30 years as this has been around?
Yeah, it's a great question. And over the past 30 plus years, what we've seen is the low-income housing tax credit is vastly oversubscribed. So there is certainly no shortage of communities or states that use it. It's distributed based to the states based on their population. And there is no state that has credits left over. They are oversubscribed nationally each year, somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1 in terms of the number of applications submitted to the ones that the states have enough funding to award. So that's part of the reason we've been advocating to expand the credit, because we certainly don't see any issue in uptake or sophistication. That the issue is just a lack of affordable housing resources and dollars to meet the demand for all of the affordable housing that could be built. Each of those applications that doesn't get funded each year represents a very sophisticated, shovel-ready project that just isn't able to get the credits.
So when you say that you're advocating to expand the credit, what are you guys doing in your advocacy hat to make that happen?
So we've been advocating since 2016 for a bipartisan piece of legislation called the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which at various points has had the support of close to half of Congress, both sides of the aisle, which, considering today's partisan environment and also that, the low-income housing tax credit isn't maybe something that, every single person has heard of, but to have almost half of Congress sign on to this bill to expand the credit shows you just how much affordable housing has really gained attention and how much policymakers have really seen the need to do something. So the basic idea is to increase affordable housing resources by 50% on the allocation, more than we have today, and to make a number of other changes to the program to really just increase production, but also streamline and strengthen the program. And we've seen a few expansions either get enacted into law or almost get enacted into law recently. In 2018, we got the first expansion of the housing credit in a decade when we got a 12.5% cap increase that lasted for 4 years. Unfortunately, it expired at the end of 2021. So that's something that we are working to extend very urgently this year now that it's expired. But also, just meeting where we were at 2018 levels is not enough. So we're seeking to still increase resources by even more on top of that. And there was a proposal to do that in the Build Back Better legislation. The most recent versions of it would have expanded the annual housing credit allocation by almost 40%, in addition to some other proposals that would help increase production. But of course, we've seen Build Back Better stall. So we're still working to advance those proposals wherever we can, even if the legislative outlook is a little bit murkier now.
So part of expanding and strengthening this housing credit, when you go to the legislators and you go to the decision makers and, you want to talk about extending the cap and streamlining, where do you first start in that advocacy pitch, if you will? Everybody, probably agrees to expand affordable housing. But how do you go about doing that from, a practical standpoint on the, one-on-one advocacy piece?
The most effective thing we've done is to get members of Congress and their staff out to see low-income housing tax credit properties, because you can explain the program, you can show diagrams, you can share data, and we do all of that as well, all of the traditional advocacy and meetings with members of Congress and staff here in Washington, D.C. But the thing that really makes the program jump out in policymakers' mind is when they actually see the properties in their states and districts. They meet with the residents, they hear the stories about what having affordable housing means for individual people's lives. And that's what's really separated the supporters of the program from the real champions of the program. They can always point to a specific corner of, an intersection in their district that used to have a rundown building, and now it's this real example of a great, revitalization of the community. It's provided homes to people who need it, and they remember those stories. So especially when your average policymaker is dealing with so many issues on any given day, and they're jumping from whether it's COVID relief to Russia and then affordable housing, what really gets them to remember the impact and remember the stories is getting them out to see the property. So once they have really internalized the value of affordable housing, which is what these types of visits typically achieve, then, when we propose various modifications to the program, they have more of a context for understanding how this all fits in, why it's important. So we really start with the tangible examples and then build from that.
I also appreciate that easy path to advocacy that you've got on your website. And I put this plug in here because you do an amazing job of even giving sample social media suggestions. And I just love that because, you're truly trying to get not just the before and after photo, not just the education and awareness and, build that champion like you mentioned, but you're also saying, hey, here's some tools by which that's really effective for you to do it. So good job to you guys for incorporating that as part of the advocacy path.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. And on that note, let's take a break. But coming up in the second part of my conversation with Emily Cadik, Emily talks about the mission of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition.
We've got an affordable housing crisis, and the only way we can meaningfully increase the affordable housing supply is to expand the low-income housing tax credit. And so while some of the policy proposals we have are a little more detailed than that, that's really the basic goal here.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.